Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to Resolution Foundation this morning. Before we do anything else, I want to let you know that today's event has a new feature. We are going to introduce the Resolution Foundation klaxon. So if you hear this noise, then that means that someone has called the upcoming event on the 3rd of March a spring statement or a budget or a fiscal event. Because if there is one thing that the Treasury wants you to know about the 3rd of March, it's that it is not a budget or a statement or a fiscal event, even though there may be a statement on the day. Indeed, a Treasury spokesperson said yesterday, the goal is to be as boring as possible. So that is not our goal today, but that is the Treasury's goal on the 3rd of March. So we all know the best part in any case of any fiscal event is the OBR forecast and the accompanying economic and fiscal outlook that they publish. So despite the 3rd of March being merely a forecast, we wanted to take the opportunity to look ahead to what it might say and to take stock, perhaps more importantly, of the latest economic news and what it might mean for government policy in the months and years ahead. We have, as usual, a fantastic panel to help us do that. Karen Ward is Managing Director at JP Morgan Asset Management and previously Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for the then Chancellor Philip Hammond. Yael Selfin is Vice Chair and Chief Economist at KPMG in the UK. And Andy King is a Specialist Partner at Flink Global and former member of the OBR's Budget Responsibility Committee. And James Smith is, I'm delighted to say now, Chief Economist at Resolution Foundation, and he in a moment will take you through his predictions for the 3rd of March. If you would like to ask a question online, there'll be the chance to do that in the room. If you would like to ask one online, then you can go to Slido, and the hashtag is SpringStatement26. And we're going to work on our reaction time and see if we can get that a bit faster, but hopefully the Treasury is not watching our Slido hashtags. James, over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Ruth. So today we're talking about the spring statement. Come on, Emma. All right. I think we've got enough mileage this. But anyway, we're here for talking about the event that's on the 3rd of March. What is really striking is that nobody is talking about the spring forecast. You've got people doing different events today, but we're here for it, and I'm glad to see you guys are here for it too, literally in person, so welcome for that. And I guess the reason that we're not talking about the spring statement is the government has been very clear that it would like to do one fiscal event per year, and the spring statement is the thing that it doesn't want to do. And believe me, I am here for this, because every time there is a fiscal event, I essentially lose a night's sleep, and I'm dead against that. I do like my sleep. So it's great that they're doing it, but I just wanted to start by, if you'll indulge me, just to go a little bit down memory lane and remind you how that one fiscal event thing is actually going. So it all started within a month of the election. We had Rachel Reeves popping up to really brighten our days and tell us that there was a 22 billion black hole in the public finances, overseen by Ruth at the time. That was the first step here. By the way, that black hole turned out to be much bigger, but anyway, that's for another day. We then had the autumn budget that year, one of the biggest fiscal events there's ever been, change of fiscal rules, huge rise in taxes and spending. We had the spring statement in 2025. If you remember, this is the one where the outlook had deteriorated and the government responded by some benefit cuts they then abandoned. We don't really talk about that one. That's the one pretty much everyone tries to forget. Then we had the spending review, and then we had last year's budget. So if anything, this government has definitely been keeping busy on fiscal events, but this time they've been very clear that the spring forecast will be just that. It'll be a forecast. What we're trying to do really today is give the government a nudge on whether this should be a complete non-event. Are we in a position where the country doesn't have the sort of economic problems that demand a policy response? You can see that's quite leading in terms of where we're getting to on all this. So we put out some slides this morning on all this, so that takes you through all the details. I commend you to the slides. Thanks to my co-authors for that. So definitely do check that out. But I'll give you a potted summary of where we're getting to on the spring statement. I guess the obvious place to start is what's been happening to the fiscal position. So let me give you a very quick run through of the economic news since we had the budget just 3 months ago. Now, this is going to feel a bit like Groundhog Day, but what has happened since the budget is that growth has disappointed once again. So growth slowed very sharply in the second half of last year, second half of 2025. And if you look, you really have to stare at this chart. If you look at the difference between the black line and the green line, which is the OBR had expected growth, OBR nice and optimistic, had expected growth to pick up. That didn't happen. So we're already about 0.4% behind the OBR forecast in terms of where GDP is. By the way, we make a point in our slides that some of this topsy-turvy, strong first half, weak second half of the year dynamics that we've been seeing are to do with some of the seasonal factors after the pandemic. So if you're really interested in that sort of detail, then I definitely commend you looking at that material. So growth is down, inflation is also down relative to the OBR forecast, not by much, but if you look where the Bank of England is, it's a little bit lower. That's the first time in terms of that first year forecast that the Bank of England has been lower than the OBR since before the pandemic. So the OBR has tended to be a bit more optimistic about how quickly inflation will fall back. So we expect the OBR to slightly mark down their inflation forecast. By the way, inflation is going to go back to normal as of April. So that's something I don't think anyone in this room will be ready for after more than half a decade of seesawing, but that would be extremely welcome. The other bit of news here is that the labour market has been weakening, probably a bit faster than even the Bank of England expected. So we had unemployment rising to 5.2% in the latest data. So we think there's going to be a little bit of marking up of unemployment. The other sort of big bit of economic news is on migration. Now, we don't get migration stats very frequently, but the ones we have had have pointed to a much sharper fall in net migration than the OBR had built into their forecast. Now, we don't get new projections from the ONS for a while, so we don't think we'll get a wholesale increase in what the OBR published. But even this small adjustment to take on the latest data will matter for the fiscal projections and will take about 3 billion to borrowing. So the migration really matters. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So we've got some downside economic news that's going to push up on borrowing. Against that, we've had falls in interest rates, predominantly because of this slightly faster fall in inflation. What you're looking at on the left is basically what's happening to policy rates. On the right, what's happening to the cost of government borrowing. And we've had about a third of a percentage point lower government borrowing costs, and that would tend to reduce borrowing by around 5 billion. So essentially what we've had since the budget, not long, is some pretty small, albeit interesting, but offsetting news in terms of the public finances. So stuff above the line here is increasing borrowing, stuff below the line is reducing it. You can see those interest rates offsetting that weaker economic news. And the key point here is we think the fiscal outlook will be pretty little changed here as we come into the spring forecast. So we estimate that borrowing will be about $1 billion higher, so headroom would be about 20 billion as opposed to about 22 billion at the time of the budget. So in and of itself, the news that we've had since the budget doesn't push you to wanting to have a big event. But what's happening to the economy, the central case, that's not the only thing that's going on here. We should worry about risks here too. So what's going on in that space? And I think what you'll hear a lot about around the time of the spring forecast itself is some of these big policy spending risks. So we're hearing about what the government is doing on special educational needs this morning. It sounds like cuts are coming in the next few days here, but there is a sort of 8 billion or so gap in that category of spending that's essentially baked into the forecast, and we don't know how the government is going to reconcile. So either it has to spend more or it has to find some cuts. And it sounds like there'll be some of those cuts coming. And at the same time, the government has said it wants to up its defence spending, and that could be a really big ticket item here. The figure we've pulled out here is if the government wants to bring defence spending to 3% of national income in this parliament, so that's a much sharper rise from the current sort of 2.5 level than it currently has built in. That would add about 10 billion to day-to-day spending. It would be a bit more on total spending, but 10 billion is the bit that kind of matters for the fiscal rules here. So there's definitely policy risks here. On top of that, the government has a lot of pretty tricky tax rises to deliver. So fuel duty is increasing later this year in the plans for the first time since 2011, and God, I hope that happens, but it's certainly an unpopular policy that's proved extremely difficult to deliver in the past. And we've got these really big tax rises coming in around the time of the election. So there's big policy risks associated with the current fiscal position. Although none of these, I would argue, look like they need to be fixed right now, even if you're hearing the government, sort of saying things on some of these areas. If we look at the forecast, there's also some risks as well. So just bring you back to what's going on the net migration side. So the red line on this chart is basically showing you an alternative projection here, which essentially takes the government's impact assessment of its changes to the net migration regime and tries to figure out what that would look like in forecast terms. And if you do that, then the population, that suggests population growth about 100,000 lower going forward into the projections. And with the weaker data that we've had, that would reduce the population by about 750,000 by the end of the forecast period. So that's obviously really, really chunky. Exactly how the OBR treat that, I think, is a question that we'll hear a lot more about as they come to think more about. But there's questions about, what happens on spending, what happens about the composition of those migrants, but they could be a sort of 10 billion or even larger risk to borrowing, pushing up on borrowing. And then the other thing going the other way that people should keep in mind is what's going on with wages. So the big story of the budget was the expected markdown to longer term productivity, longer term growth, that was offset by the OBR becoming much more optimistic about the outlook for wages. But there's a lot more the OBR could do in this space. So if you compare the blue line here, which is the Bank of England forecast, it's still about a percentage point stronger than the OBR's. And the OBR's wage forecast looks like it just settles at a lower rate, about 2%. That's too low given its assumptions on productivity and inflation. So there's more of this to come. That could add as much as that could reduce borrowing by as much as 20 billion. So these are big numbers. So every percentage point here gives you about 10 billion on borrowing. So this is really, really chunky stuff in terms of how much difference it could make. But overall, there are risks here that definitely matter. I'm sure we'll talk more about them. But there's nothing here that says we urgently need to have a policy-heavy spring statement to deal with these risks. So what about the spring? Thank you. Oh my God, I can't believe I unwittingly actually walked into that. Anyway, so I've written it on a slide as well. That's even worse. But anyway, so what should we? So what should the priorities be as we come to this point in the policy cycle? Well, the big thing we talk about in the slides is basically what's been going on with the UK economy, and if you look at how weak it's been since the pandemic, what really jumps out is how weak the UK's consumption recovery is. So households look really, really cautious. A big part of this is what's happening to interest rates. Interest rates are going up, families are saving more, but that's happening to a larger extent in the UK than it is in other countries. And what seems to be different about the UK is the heightened uncertainty, particularly policy uncertainty. So this is quite a complicated chart, but don't worry, I'll hold your hand through it. So the blue line here is a measure of policy uncertainty for the UK. But what we've done is try and strip out the global component, because there's a fair amount of uncertainty emanating from the US. That's one for Karen to tell us all about. But the UK bits of this have been strikingly high and rising over the past couple of years. And you can see we've shaded areas where there's been fiscal events, and it looks like that policy uncertainty is rising around the time of fiscal events. It certainly did in 2022, around the time of the mini budget. So that's another headwind for spending, and it's understandable that the government wants to try and minimise that policy uncertainty. But at the same time, it should not lose sight of growth. So one thing I keep reminding people is if you properly account for what's going on in the labour market, and particularly the under-recording of the problems that we've had with the labour force survey in terms of recording employment, we've actually had quite strong productivity growth. So about 2%, the highest levels that are not been sustained since before the financial crisis. So pretty strong, pretty decent productivity growth when you measure it properly. As we argue in the paper that we show you on the right, we don't think that's linked very closely to the policies that the government has put in place. And there's lots of other things going on here in terms of drivers of faster productivity. So we think there is scope for the government to go further in its policy, have an even bigger impact, ride these green shoots and drive faster growth. And at the same time, the government should not lose sight of living standards. So in terms of what's actually going on living standards, so we put out a piece with our Unsung Britain book that we launched last week that looked at the prospects for living standards. And basically, if you focus in on 2026, 27, you're actually seeing some pretty decent growth overall. So typical family incomes rising over 1%. It's not gangbusters by any means, but it's been a struggle to get up to that levels recently. And the boost from particularly the two-child limit, some of the other benefit things, means that the rise is even larger for low-income families. But beyond that, the outlook is pretty bleak, with real incomes falling. So you can see that by the negative bars. So families struggling with the cost of living, the outlook for incomes is pretty bleak. You know, there's a rationale for doing some policy here. And then the other thing that's coming onto the radar, as well as the weakening of the labour market, is particularly the plight of young people, the number of workless young people. So if you look at youth unemployment rates, that's gone above the EU average for the first time on record. So there's been a worrying rise here. So we're not short of things that the government might want to do. So let me wrap up by saying we've got these, we've had this small news, we've got some fiscal risk, but neither of those really suggest that you should have a big spring statement. And there is an argument for saying we've just had too much policy uncertainty. That's part of what's holding the economy back. So a smaller event is understandable, and it's something the government should do to try and support the economy. But we don't think the government should just clock off here. That doesn't mean having a massive spring statement, but it does mean focusing on economic policy. And what it needs to do is double down on growth, really think about those distributional living standards issues that we've been talking about. And the final point we make is around the OBR, where there's been one or two worrying bits in terms of the political discourse about potentially reducing the role of the OBR. We've got the Treasury Select Committee reviewing the OBR. We've got some noises from even parts of the Labour Party saying that the OBR are part of the problem, not solution. Ruth and I, together with Imogen Stone, have put out a piece today essentially saying the government should be strengthening the OBR rather than weakening it, telling it what not to publish, and it should do that by boosting its resources and allowing it to publish the pre-measures forecast ahead of a fiscal event to sort of drive down some of that uncertainty debate. So there's a big issue there. But yes, the government should be not clocking off from doing economic policy. And let me leave it there.
Great, thanks, James. So, Karen, I'm really looking forward to zooming out a bit from the UK and thinking about how we compare to others. And I think we were going to pick out one slide from our longer deck, which just shows you the richness of material if you have the time to go through it. Hopefully it's coming. But Karen, you wanted to talk particularly, I think, about how the UK compares to the US.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think fiscal events, didn't get the klaxon. I mean, it's hard. It's sort of a competition for how you can be most depressing, isn't it?
Very hard.
But one of the charts that I think is actually most depressing in your whole pack, you didn't bring up. You spared the people of it. But I'm afraid I'm going to bring it up and talk about this one. So this is the performance of the UK relative to other economies. And particularly the US. And this, I think, is the most upsetting chart in the whole pack because this is total GDP, real GDP, so of course this is then dictates everything, living standards, etc., employment. And the UK is the red line and the US is the blue line. So what is going so horrifically wrong here relative to the US and what's within our power to change it? Well, I picked out a few things of what I think is happening in the US relative to us. The first is they have remained much more expansive in fiscal policy. Their pandemic-related literal checks in the post was then followed up with the Inflation Reduction Act and so forth, and lots of subsidies. And they're still in the checks in the post category. They are with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, receiving a whole load of tax rebates at the moment. So they are fiscally much more expansive, but they are the US and has the exorbitant privilege. So they are running an 8% deficit forevermore as far as we can see, but under no apparent pressure in the bond market to change that. So that's them. We don't have that option. The other thing that's going on in the US is they are enjoying a big capex boom as they're building out all of the infrastructure to facilitate artificial intelligence. Again, that's probably not a big lever that we can pull here in the UK. But there's something else that's going on, and you touched on this, James, but again, I think it's shown more clearly in the next chart, if we wouldn't mind going on. And that's in the behaviour of our consumer compared to the US. I think it'll come up in just a moment, but I can give you some numbers which talk about it in a different way.
I don't think we have that, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, go to the big pack, or if not, but it's the point about, so I'll tell you the numbers. So since the pandemic, US consumption has risen 18% and UK consumption has risen 1.5%. And basically what's happened, we all remember when we were stuck at home, we were forced to save. So we had this forced saving. Then we came out of the pandemic and the US has basically spent it. They've spent their accumulated pot, so they've been running a lower than average savings rate. And that really, I think, accounts for that consumption relative to us, whereas we were forced to save, and then we've come out and actually maintained a much higher rate of savings. So we used to be like the US. We were very never, spend as much as we could. We ran a savings rate around 5% like them. We have been running a savings rate akin to Germany, which we are not those people. What is happening here in the UK that we've suddenly become so prudent? So something is going on in our psyche, and it's actually not just the household sector. Our household sector, I would say, is in fabulous financial shape. Debt is lower than it has been since 2002. So our balance sheets on our household sector are in great shape, and actually our corporates as well. Corporate debt in the UK is lower than it's been since 1998. So for all the doom and gloom, actually here in the UK, our private sector is in fabulous financial health. So what is wrong with us, and why don't we want to spend money, given it's not debt and being overburdened by debt, which is usually the problem? And I do think this is a real confidence issue. And this is where I think many of the points you made, James, about how policy uncertainty is feeding into that confidence is really, really important, and why we cannot squander another year. So the only thing you said, James, in your statement, which I disagreed with, which you used the line, none of these need to be fixed immediately, about longer term spending problems. I just disagree, because if we go through yet another year where we are speculating on which taxes are going to go up through the course of the year, we're going to have another year of economically debilitating paralysis. And we're going to once again run, therefore, with very high savings rate, no growth, and therefore no actual, therefore, sustainable ability to fix public services, spend more, and achieve some of the other things that we want to do, which is improve inequality, etc. So, key points from me are that we have a real opportunity this year for our private sector to flourish. The global backdrop is also going to be very confidence enhancing. President Trump, has anybody noticed? It's been a very quiet couple of weeks. We have not been bombarded with new news. And I think that that is a sign of things to come, because the president is now focusing on the midterms, which are in November. So I think he's done a lot of the more outward-looking disruptive factors. And as we focus through the course of this year, he'll be more internally facing and focusing on not keeping the stock market elevated and everybody happy. So I think that global uncertainty will ease. Germany is about to spend 12% of its GDP over the next couple of years. So one of our biggest trading partners is going on a spending spree. The global backdrop's going to really improve. That should help business confidence. It should help household confidence. Let's please not squander it with our domestic squabbling.
Great, thanks, Karen. So should the 3rd of March be a fiscal event?
I don't want to hear. I'd like you to bring your klaxon out through the whole course of the year.
Okay, no budget, not even in the autumn. Great. Yale, your thoughts on where the UK is at the moment and what the government could do?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to be relatively positive, I think, so that's good, and continue with your theme as well. I think we're in a good position on a number of fronts. One is when you look at the overall macro policy framework, I think we're at a point where the Bank of England has more room, the monetary policy has more room now where we're reaching the target, but there's definitely more space now to use monetary policy towards focusing on macroeconomic stability, and then we can really shift fiscal policy towards structural policies, essentially trying to resolve structural policies. So that's great, you know. I think that's a really good point, and that should really guide the Treasury and the Chancellor when they look at what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing. And I would leave it there. Yeah. And then just looking about the priorities, we've got the cost of living. We're hearing a lot about cost of living, but when you actually look at inflation, again, this is good news. Inflation is going down. It's likely to reach the BOE target very soon, which means that when it comes to pressure and cost on living, the immediate pressure on cost on living, that is easing as well, which is very good, which means that a lot of the focus that you want to have is on increasing the sustainable rise in household wealth, and a lot of it will need to come from stronger productivity. You know, there's no free lunches. You can't just spend. That money needs to come from somewhere. So I think that is also relatively clear what needs to be done. Looking at productivity, we've had some positive data, but I'd say it is actually relatively recent stretch of data. Productivity could be very volatile and can be revised in terms of the data as well. We all know that. So I think it's a little bit too early to say we've got it, we've nailed it, but I'm generally positive. I think there's so much new technology that should help us improve productivity. So I think we will get there, but I think it may be a bit slower to actually get the stronger results. So what should be done in terms of policy? For me, there's just a few areas where I think we should focus. One of them is technology and really encouraging the adoption of technology. I think you're absolutely right. We are not going to have that boost that the US has in terms of the creation of the technology, in terms of the models, etc. But in terms of working on the adoption models or the applications, in the UK we could have a really strong role, play a really strong role there. And I think that is where policy needs to focus, enabling that and encouraging businesses to adopt it, and also the public sector. You know, that's also really, really important in terms of leading the way and showing how it can be done. And I mean, let's not underestimate how difficult that is to adopt new technology while you're running. Yeah, and the difficulty is. So I think more support and help and encouraging in adopting new technology is extremely important. Then the other area we have is trade, ultimately. Very important. You mentioned Germany, but we need to be closer to Germany in order to actually benefit. So we've seen quite a lot on new trade deals. I think when you look at the impact for the UK economy, those new trade deals, I'd say, will not necessarily be as impactful as becoming closer to the European market. That is very important for us. So I think that is really key. Then there's housing, house building, especially within the capital, within London, is very important in order to ease bottlenecks and also in order to address that pressure on lower income households. That's very important in terms of affordability, in terms of pricing. We really need to tackle that. I think we're very, very far from getting somewhere concrete. And then finally, it's what Karen touched on as well, and that's the policy stability. It's the removing that uncertainty that is very important. And that's where we differ a little bit, because I'm actually very positive about the rise in household saving ratio, because I think ultimately we do need to encourage more responsible way of looking at household finances. Our government will not have the funding to pay us generous pension later on, given where we are, where we're going to be, and therefore we do need to encourage more household saving. But it's the private sector investment that we also need to encourage on the back of it, and the uncertainty and the impact that has on business investment is very damaging for our economy. So I'll stop here.
Really interesting. Thanks, Yael. Andy, you feeling optimistic too?
Never, no. Ever since my, calm career was spoilt in 2007, being a bit pessimistic has been the right thing to be. So I thought I'd just look at, what my former colleagues down the road at the OBR will be thinking. I thought, James, your chart where you had like all the revisions, the different things offsetting almost perfectly to leave headroom exactly where it was. I think the OBR would be quite relieved if they got to the end of their own forecast process and it looked something like that. So that essentially, when they provide their update in a couple of weeks, there's nothing to see here. They get a few months out of the spotlight. They get time to focus on their new chair if the Treasury get round to advertising. And they get to find out whether it will be this Prime Minister and Chancellor that takes them through to the autumn budget. So I think they would very much welcome a quiet non-event on the 3rd of March. But, and I think this is sort of what Karen was saying, to me it does feel like kicking the can in a way that is not hugely helpful. So I think you can think of this in terms of maybe 2 in-trays. One for the new OBR chair when the time comes. So there are some pretty huge, quite tough forecast judgments that need to be taken. It's sensible not to take them now when the committee is not fully personed, but it doesn't make them any less difficult. The summer work programme is going to be tricky. So you highlighted migration. Obviously, that's a big fiscal judgment and economic judgment, but it's hugely politically charged. For that to be the first thing you have to do in that job is not going to be pleasant. I think you make the point that wage growth could be stronger. I think equally, employment growth could be a lot weaker than they have. I think basically, when I look at those 2 sets of numbers, I think their very weak wage growth forecast is because they expect the national insurance cut to be switched from being a heads impact to being a wages impact over several years. Maybe they're right, but maybe it's just that unemployment's going to stay higher because we've changed the structure of the labour market. I find it quite surprising actually that the OBR and the Treasury are sticking to their guns, that the combined impact of raising employer national insurance and the minimum wage has not been more damaging to employment than they originally thought. It seems it looks kind of clear. And I also have on my list, I'm interested that the saving rate came up twice. The saving rate forecast in the budget forecast, it declines sharply over every one of the next 5 years. And in a kind of accounting sense, that is how the budget deficit falls. It's consumption running faster than incomes, generating tax revenues. Now, obviously, there's lots of other things going on, but it just has the slight aroma, I think, of conviction forecasting. I'm not sure what drives that. So that's a pretty unpleasant list of forecast issues for the new chair. I think it makes it hugely important that they do choose someone and have them in place by the summer, because that summer work programme, that new chair, has to own all of those decisions. And then there's the in-tray for either a new chancellor or this chancellor rebooted after the by-elections and the May elections. And that's all those policy risks you listed. So defence spending, huge. The send overspending, huge. Health and disability benefits, pretty huge. This kind of self-inflicted youth unemployment problem, I mean, how do you get out of that without pretty large U-turns or pretty large spending to overcome the increase in employment costs? I think there was the agreement on drug costs for the NHS. Not quite as huge, but not small. And all those tax rises that are slated to come in a year before the election. Energy prices. So a huge list of policy issues that uncertainty about how they're going to be resolved kind of makes those forecast judgments a little bit difficult to see them holding. So, you know, a quiet spring statement is great, but the fundamental issues are still there. They loom as large as ever.
Nice.
And I guess the only thing is that I really hope that this long list of issues, because everyone's talking about them, they continue to be talked about so that they will be resolved. Because that kind of conspiracy of silence that ran into the last election is part of why the first year or so of this government has been so difficult.
Great, thank you very much, Andy and everyone. Loads for us to dig into there. And I think the kind of point about consumer spending and confidence has clearly come out. We've had, as you say, Karen, this quite remarkable shift in a way, as Yale says, a shift that we've been sort of waiting for in the UK for a long time, but the transition is still a very painful one, and it's not clear it's coming from a sense of confidence in the future rather than uncertainty. I wonder if we might dig into the labour market a bit more, because Andy, you make an interesting point that the sort of the wage assumption looks pessimistic, but the employment assumption perhaps looks optimistic. Karen Yale, what are your thoughts on the kind of UK labour market as you see it at the moment?
Well, I mean, I want Andy to. You very definitively said self-inflicted. So you're. I mean, I don't know if we can bring up. I'm really pushing the staff over there. You've got klaxon and slides, but you've got that chart of youth unemployment in the UK compared to everyone else, and that chart really puzzles me. But Andy understands it, so I would like him to explain it to me. But I do think that it again comes back to this point about uncertainty causing paralysis. And actually, this is happening elsewhere in the world. We've got this situation in the US as well as here in the UK where GDP is running better than the labour market. The broader economy looks better than job growth. Now, you could argue that that is AI already, and therefore we're finding bots to take the jobs. I'm not convinced, actually. I think, it's far too early. We're not seeing the technologies deployed. And I think, how do you distinguish between whether companies are doing that or whether they're just seeing an incredibly politically chaotic world and thinking, I'm not going to spend any money on hiring or investment right now because who knows what tomorrow will bring. I think we can't disentangle the two stories. I personally think it's more the latter at the moment. But this chart, again, why do we look so different relative to everyone else? And it's an awful chart. And, we sort of talk about social media, but obviously all these countries have social media, and AI. Well, no, everybody's got AI. So Andy, but so tell me, you were just so definitive that what it was self-inflicted.
Possibly self-inflicted.
Okay, is this liberal?
So, I mean, it's the change in employment costs, isn't it?
Okay, right.
The employer national insurance rise was structured in such a way that it was particularly proportionately large for those on lower incomes or part-time jobs. Yeah. The minimum wage was raised significantly, but the youth minimum wage was raised by close to 20%, I think. Yeah. And I think James had a lovely chart on this after the 2024 budget. But it hit sectors where you have relatively lower paid people or more part-time work, retail, hospitality. And those are the sectors where young people, get their first job. And so relative to 2 years ago, employment costs that you would expect to drive youth unemployment are significantly higher. Now, obviously, there will be lots of other things going on, but that thing, I think you can kind of identify and say that should have a material impact on youth unemployment.
But the big thing here has been the sort of interaction with the minimum wage policy and the national insurance policy, where the left hand and the right hand don't seem to be quite coordinated in terms of what it's doing. And I suppose we were talking in the office about what the government could do policy-wise, and we're already hearing from the Chancellor hints that they might change tack on their equalisation of youth minimum wages, and that would be a policy I think you could bring in relatively quickly. It's obviously not a fiscal cost, it's something you could do quite quickly that would help in this situation. But I do have sympathy with this with this idea that the combination of those two policies has just made it really tough at the bottom end of the labour market. You do see that, and that is part of what's going on productivity, right? It's not a huge part, but we're seeing jobs are being cut at the bottom end of the labour market, lower productivity jobs. And what we're not seeing yet is really big creation of higher productivity jobs. So, if you think we have to transform to an economy that's higher productivity, has better jobs, we're seeing the first bit of that. So labour is, we're seeing higher unemployment, labour availability, but it's just not yet translating into the better jobs, higher growth that we need as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on 2 points here. One is we're still relatively low compared. We've got some countries here, but there's more that are much higher than the UK. So we're starting from a relatively very strong base compared to other European economies in particular, where that was an issue, has been an issue for a long time. And then it's really all about the skills and making sure that we've had these cost issues that I hear a lot from clients and businesses, that this is a real issue for them. But then we just need to match the skills to allow them to actually be hired, so as actually to be worth the pay. I'd say it's not really about lowering their wage, it's more about getting them ready to be able to receive that wage.
But there's a time inconsistency problem there then, isn't it? Because if you've upped the cost with no plans for the skills gap, I mean, this is the risk, isn't it, with all the youth stuff, is you end up with generations lost and the fiscal consequence of that. Let alone for those individuals, of course, we should highlight that that's the much more horrific thing, is again, we can't dither around on this, can we? This is all really important stuff.
And there's also two separate arguments about youth minimum wage. I think one is, should you ever expect that there's a sort of skills policy that means that the value of an 18-year-old and the value of a 25-year-old is the same? And so should you structurally aim, as Labour said they would, for the two rates to be the same? But even if you thought that you should, it's hard to look at that chart and say now is the time to make further progress towards it. And it was interesting yesterday after Alan Milburn spoke, there was quite a lot of this debate about whether the youth problem that we have is a supply problem or a demand problem. Is it a lack of young people wanting to work or a lack of jobs? And this is an unemployment chart, right? So this is a lack of jobs. Actually, if you look at NEET rates, so people not in education, employment or training, then compared to other countries, the trend may not be so striking, but the rates for the UK are more troubling. So it's definitely not a good picture. To pivot to something quite different, I might just bring up a question we had online, which I think is another question kind of pertinent for the 3rd of March. That's the one. We touched on defence spending, but quite briefly, and I think this is quite important as we look at the fiscal picture across this Parliament. What's the panel's view? I might come to you first, Andy, on, is defence spending the sort of thing we can exempt from a fiscal rule like Germany's done?
I think it's quite difficult to do that because you can make sort of a good case for quite a lot of spending lines being special. So I think if you take the question there at face value, like borrowing costs are lower, that creates some space, but that space is taken up many times over if you think about the list that we've gone through of defence and send and so on and so on. And so it's not obvious that there is kind of genuine space for more spending. It could be prioritised that any space should go for defence spending. That's quite reasonable. The idea that just pretending that gilts that are issued to finance defence spending are different to gilts that are issued to finance the rest of government, I'm not sure the UK can do that. I don't think I would ever have been sure that they could do that, but not right now when there's uncertainty about policy, there's uncertainty about politics too.
I might just pick on why Germany maybe could do that, and that's because the direction of travel in the EU this is part of their union plans to take, it's very important that as a club, the continent is working together because of the approach from Russia. And therefore, I suspect what we will see on the continent within the EU is that defence gets taken onto a common balance sheet and will be financed at the EU level.
Yeah.
But we're not in that club anymore. So that's why we're in a different boat.
Although it feels like at points, Keir Starmer might be trying to see if we could be part of the defence club without being...
Well, maybe, I mean, you could maybe argue that if the UK was using defence to enter the club, then, as Andy says, I think that do you take it off the fiscal rule or off the balance sheet, that should always be, is this spending that's going to pay for itself in time through future tax receipts? That's why capital is okay, although careful of how you use the word capital. Maybe you could argue if we were doing that for defence because we were getting closer to Europe, we'd have a growth payoff because of it and it would be okay. So there's you could probably flex that.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add, when you look at the European policy at this stage, it's quite clear that what they're doing at the moment in terms of the dispensation, it's a transitional story where they are going to borrow more now, but ultimately they know they will need to cut other things to pay for it. So it is really just a transition. And things like welfare spending in particular will need to be cut to pay for it later on, over time.
Would anyone in the room like to ask a question? Conscious we've got an audience here. Yes, Catherine.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the listening to everybody's commentary. So I have a couple questions for Jim. You commented on the tax difficulties towards the end of the budget horizon. Would you say those are more or less difficult than constraining spending throughout the budgetary horizon? For Karen, you commented on the aggregate savings rate. What about the distribution of households, of business size, and regions? And I think you might get a different impression. For Yale, you have a priority of lots of priorities. If you had to choose between R&D and uptake of technology by business or housing, which would you do? And for Andy, what about scenarios for the OBR's key assumptions? Scenarios being kind of in favor these days.
Tempted to just swap chairs, Catherine, but thank you for your excellent questions. James, tax or spending, which is harder?
Yeah, I think both are hard. Let's be very clear. I mean, I suppose the key thing here is what the government seems to be doing is pushing the adjustment out and hoping that they get lucky with the forecast and they don't actually have to deliver a tax rise. They don't have to deliver spending cuts. I personally think the fact that they have committed to a multi-year spending review process sounds boring, but what they're basically saying is we're going to minimise the extent to which we engage in fiscal fiction. So when we cut spending, we're going to tell you how it's done. When we raise taxes, we're going to spend how it's done. So I think that is a big step forward. The problem here is how does this play out if you end up in a position where you actually have to deliver those tax rises, and that I think is much more difficult here. I think the only thing I would add to that is this approach of freezing a tax threshold seems to be the one massive tax change across multiple governments that seems to have been delivered without big drama, without big political risks. You know, we're not seeing the tractors driving around Westminster for CPI or other measures operating of different tax thresholds. So the government seems to be successful in that. And so I think that makes it more deliverable on the face of it. But I agree it's a big risk in the government's plans.
And Karen, on the distribution of consumers?
Yeah, I mean, Catherine, you're absolutely right. I think the argument, the pushback to me would be that, look, all of that wealth or that buffer has been accumulated by a small subsection of the wealthy, and therefore they aren't going to be a driving force in the economy. But the problem with that is I think you could say that even more about the US. I mean, if we think about our fiscal support and how it was distributed across households here in the UK via the furlough scheme versus how the US behaved in that buffer accumulating period, I would say we were much more progressively distributed. And whereas the US savings rate has therefore come right down. So I don't think, to me, it explains the fact that it's more, I don't think it is more distributed to a high end in the UK versus the US. So it doesn't explain to me the consumption gap. I still think across all households here, there is accumulated savings amongst a broader group. And for some reason, they are just not feeling good about the future and spending it. We need some US self-belief, Catherine.
And when we looked at the distribution a little bit, albeit over the last sort of 10, 20 years in Unsung Britain, copies are available upstairs, we actually do find reductions in consumer debt and slightly higher savings ratios, even among lower income families. The big caveat to that is we see these big rises in energy bill arrears and in council tax arrears. So there may also be some forms of debt that are not picked up in all the data, and so definitely really interesting story there. Yale, right? Do you remember your question?
Yes. Oh no. R&D for tech versus housing. So I think it's simple. It's simple in the sense that you need to make it simple. You need to simplify incentives. So just looking at the incentives for tech, for example, and R&D and stuff, you need to do something that is easy for even smaller businesses to do, not just the big stuff. So R&D subsidies, for example, are too cumbersome for smaller businesses to apply for normally. So you just think of, does it actually add value? Do companies actually do more R&D on the basis of having that, rather than just it's a wasted incentive because they would have done it anyway. So I think for incentives, if you could do something that is quite broad through the tax system, as simple as possible, that's great, and it will cost money, yeah, definitely to some degree. On housing, for me, the solution, if you like, is less about pouring money in, and where we may differ, and more about simplifying things and actually looking at where the real bottlenecks are. So it should be profitable. We should be able to find a solution, an optimal solution that is viable. We just need to think around it a bit more. We need to think, why do businesses sit on land and they do not develop it? Is it because there's backlog in the administration, so that they don't get the permissions that they need fast enough? So do we need to simplify this, or do we really need all this process? I'm not sure it's necessarily bringing more people on. I think just the more we can simplify that, and the more we can understand what's drive companies not to build genuinely, and make sure that the process is much smoother, I think there will be, and it must work, because this is such a dynamic market. There's so much demand, the values are high, so we should, with our brains, we should be able to fix it. I'm convinced, and it's not necessarily more money.
Andy, I've forgotten your question, but you might remember.
Well, I'm gonna answer James's a little bit as well. Because it just occurred to me, like, there are some tax rises that are slated for just before the election that I cannot see going ahead, at least not on that timetable. There are also the energy price cuts that are coming in April. They are due to be reversed just ahead of the election. That's not going to happen. So there are several things in the fiscal forecast that, if not like the kind of pre-election fiscal fiction that got the Paul Johnsons of this world so angry, they do look unlikely. But what I was going to say was, actually, just hearing you talk about this, that reminded me that although this autumn's budget might be quite challenging on a few issues, the most challenging looking fiscal event of the next period looks like the spending review next summer, when there's basically a bit of largesse up till then, and then the brakes are slammed on, and somehow all of these risks that are upside to the numbers have to be squeezed into a pot that's not going to grow.
Or we just continue to talk about tax rises forever.
Exactly. The question to me was about scenarios from the OBR. I'm proud to say that the OBR was a bit of a pioneer on scenarios. We, for 15 years, have been doing several scenarios in every publication. They're not always the most widely read thing, I have to say, but the low productivity scenario, which came out every couple of years, was the one to watch. But yes, I mean, all of these big issues are the kind of things that the OBR can do scenarios on. It allows people like James to put sensible numbers on everything as the news changes, so that it's not the OBR that has to do the commentary. So yeah, it's definitely a good thing.
So if
Is
you were
that
right,
low productivity, sorry,
No.
Ruth.
I
realise
There's
it's
many
not my
chairs
job
today.
Yeah, I was going to say that low productivity scenario is the one where debt goes to 600% of GDP, isn't it?
Oh, that's the long-term one. Yeah, something might give before that happens.
My
and
sanity.
if you were writing the EFO in a few weeks' time, Andy, what would be your choice of scenario?
All of it. So the challenge is, for me, it's the saving rate is the one that kind of speaks to elements of a forecast that, to me, don't quite add up. But the saving rate is the end point you reach after you make all your judgments about everything else. So it's kind of a big picture. What if employment growth were weaker, consumption were weaker relative to income, so on and so forth? How does the deficit project forward? And I guess the worry is that it looks a bit like it's been in the last 5 years of you're stuck at 4 or 5% of GDP.
Would anyone else in the room like to sneak in a question? I know there were a few other hands. One there?
Thank you, David Robinson, Market News. You've got this line in the report saying if the OBR brought its wage forecast into line with the Bank of England's, that could reduce borrowing by 20 billion. Now, with the distinguished Cathy Mann here, I think we can say safely the Bank of England itself, the MPC, does not have a unified view on where wages are going. There's a nice little box in the NPR, but it wasn't very decisive. Do you have a view on whether they should do this? They will do this? Is it really just a scenario? Because you've got the figure there, but I'm not sure really what the context is.
James, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so really helpful box in the Monetary Policy Report, worth a read if people have the time, that basically says, and this is a pretty simple calculation at its base, that a sustainable rate of wage growth is about 3.25. If you add what you think productivity growth is to what you think the inflation target is, you get a figure like 3. There's things that can happen to margins, there's things that happen with imported prices, but fundamentally that's the calculus that you're doing. Whereas the OBR's wage forecast settles at a number more like 2. And Andy's right, there's some national insurance adjustment that's going on here. So ultimately, the ABR is assuming that a lot of that is coming through weaker wages. But I think, if I had to say where I thought the adjustment would be, it seems to me that you've got the labour share, so how much you think workers are going to take of national income, that's falling in the OBR's forecast in a way that seems hard to justify given other things that we know have been going on in the labour market and elsewhere. And I think the risks are to the upside, and we saw some of that at the autumn budget. So I don't know, I would expect that to crystallise at some stage, and maybe in a stop clock kind of way I will be right at some point. I'd also like wages to actually grow sustainably at 3%. That would be good.
Just before we're out of time, I wonder if we might touch on the sort of slightly institutional question of the OBR. Andy mentioned that there's a search for a chairman or chairwoman that hasn't yet begun. We put out a note today on some changes that we might think might be helpful for the OBR 15 years on. The Treasury Select Committee has an inquiry on that topic at the moment, and I think questions from the left and the right about what the role of the OBR is and should be. Robert Jenrick confirmed yesterday that he thought that that a reform government would keep the OBR, but that he thought it needed more diversity of opinion. James, sorry to come to you twice, but do you want to just give us a quick overview of what we've said about the OBR today?
Yeah, I think, there's worries out there that the OBR's independence, OBR's role could be under question. We have politicians talking about it. We have the Treasury Select Committee looking into it. I think, the people who say it's the OBR's fault, that's why all these fiscal events are really difficult, are just missing the point, basically, completely. This is like blaming referees for the state of football. So, there might be one or two decisions where you could have a have a better game in an individual circumstance, so you might question the OBR decision. But ultimately, you need the OBR in order to run your fiscal policy in a credible way. And we argue that estimates out there suggest these sort of independent financial institutions, they bring down borrowing costs, and that's worth of the order of 30 billion to UK taxpayers. That's a big number, but we should recognise that having a framework that works adds a lot of credibility. But I think you can think of ways that you could improve what the OBR is doing, and we argue that that should go in the direction of strengthening it in terms of its resources, in terms of the size of its committee, the running of the OBR, trying to delegate that a bit beyond the chair who has to front up the substance of the forecasting as well. And I think there were a few things. If you read the Treasury's response to the National Cybersecurity Report on the OBR data breach, that gets into the territory of saying the OBR shouldn't publish this, the OBR shouldn't publish that, in a way that seems a bit unrelated to what was actually the problem with the leak. It enters into a territory of seeming to constrain an independent institution that currently doesn't have a chair, and that's a direction we wouldn't want the government to continue on. Instead, it should be strengthening the OBR rather than undermining it.
And the whole debate about the run-up to the budget has got pretty confused after kind of everything that happened, right? There was a very specific thing that happened on budget day with the release of the EFO early, but the economic damage was from all the speculation in the run-up to the budget, which was largely because it was extremely well briefed that the OBR would lower their productivity forecast, and it was assumed that that would lead to a big change in the fiscal position. And I think the idea that through sort of just security measures we can deal with budget speculation is frankly absurd. There will be budget speculation when it appears that the government is in a big fiscal hole, and the way to deal with that is actually to have transparent information about where the forecast really is. That would have actually lowered speculation, it turns out, in the run-up to this budget, and then to have a proper public debate in a contained period of time about the response. So that's why we've also said we think there's a case, as is done in a few other countries, for publishing the pre-measures forecast in the run-up to a budget rather than having it selectively briefed. But Karen, you had some time in the Treasury. Have you got any reflections on, fiscal rules, the OBR, how useful they are? Do the markets care about them at all?
Two words on the OBR, which I think sum it up, are Liz Truss. Do we need the OBR? Yes. I would say, we were saying when we were in the green room earlier that, I'm a market strategist, so I'm talking to investors all day. I can't think if I asked a single gilt investor what our fiscal rule is, they would be able to tell me about it. But I think we underestimate how important actually the fiscal rules are internally. It's for the Treasury to be able to say on an hourly basis to departments, it's a really great idea, but there's no money. And actually, it's that clarity of the fiscal rule that we are binding is really, really important as an internal tool. The markets and gilt investors are clever enough to be able to distinguish, is this a government doing sensible things? And that is much more granular than what is the headroom. That is this a government that has a growth plan, that understands it needs to have some constraint on its borrowing? So do we need a fiscal rule? Yes, probably more for internal purposes as much as external. Do we need the OBR to be strengthened rather than diluted? 100% yes.
Thank you. Yael, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I feel a little bit of frustration because I think the OBR does such great analysis, and we touched on the scenarios. Scenarios are so important, and the long-term forecast under different scenarios, it's so valuable. And I think it's a bit of a shame that we just focus very often, or the majority just focus on one number, the headroom, the official headroom number, but actually there's so much rich information there about all the other scenarios and the context, the broad context of the public finances that we should pay much more attention to and use it much more. and also give the OBR the sufficient resources to continue producing very good analysis.
Andy, you had lots of time there. Would you change anything about the OBR?
I think that yes. I mean, the OBR does a lot of what it does is I have responsibility for, so I should be careful. But I think there are some decisions that the OBR take that are so important that it would be good to have more transparency and structure around them. So, I mean, people talk about adding members to the committee. That might be difficult in fiscal event moments where you have to take a lot of decisions very quickly. But having a committee that looks at the productivity forecast in the summer ahead of a budget, I think would be very sensible. I think it's an unreasonable weight to place on one individual, which is essentially what happens, to make that call as to what that number is going to be, and therefore how much the Chancellor has to raise taxes to cover her spending plans. So I think that kind of thing could help. The thing I'm slightly worried about is that the focus is all on the OBR, where it's the broader budget process that is a problem. And if you look at the UK budget process, it's incredibly unusual to have a process that is kind of nominally secret but liberally briefed. Is supposed to be an event where everything is revealed on the day and nothing ahead of time, apart from everything the Treasury wants to make sure is not a bad surprise on the day. It's just not fit for purpose in today's kind of constant rolling news world. So I hope that someone somewhere will be looking at, should we just do what other countries do, where budget day is the second Wednesday of November? Always. The pre-budget forecast is published on whatever. Now, having the spring forecast as the kind of non-forecast update or non-event update immediately after the budget makes no sense at all. You want it immediately before the budget. So there's lots of things, I think, that could be done to make a better system. Reforming the OBR will be part of that, but I don't think it's the biggest part.
Great. Really interesting. Well, look, lots we could talk about. I'm sure we could carry on this conversation, but I hope you agree that despite the Treasury aiming for a boring event, there is lots to think about ahead of the 3rd of March, and more importantly, as we look across to the UK economy through 2026. So thank you for joining us. If you do want to make sure you don't miss any of the excellent analysis on the 3rd of March, then we will be joined by David Miles for our event to digest it all the day after. So we hope to see you there. Thanks very much. Thank you.